Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Christopher Mastropietro, my guest, my friend, my unofficial philosophical mentor to Sense Space.
Thank you, Jacob. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Very much.
To give a couple more words of introduction, Christopher has been an integral part of the reimagining of Dialogos, of giving breath and life to philosophy in the digital age. And he's been someone that I've been drawn to learn from and participate with, and our dialogues have been very informative for me. So I'm really excited to speak today.
Likewise. And to sort of start things off, we've been talking for a little while up to this point before hitting the record button. And we were just about to start talking about your work with Sense Space and the particular trajectory that you're on, the particular project that you've undertaken in long form, which I know has many, many features and facets to it. So I just selfishly want to hear more about it. And if you don't mind divulging, especially what's been going on in the last few months since last we spoke. At the time, I remember you were kind of on the precipice of some very exciting work and some very adventurous work. And we're also, flirting with some different options in terms of how you were going to undertake it, what kind of formats you were going to explore and whatnot. So I'm just very keen to hear on what the latest developments are, Jacob. And that means, materially or just interiorly, because both are valid.
Thank you, Chris. That's very, very generous of you, and I insist that we get more into your work and your ponderings as we move forward. But I'd be very happy to explore this a little bit. I was given the gift of being encouraged to follow my curiosity and interest around the age of 17 or 18. And I followed that all the way through my studies on a very interesting journey into the depths of adulthood and a very difficult phase about 2 years ago. And during that time, I was able to call upon that curiosity and interest and begin to pull myself towards a golden thread of sorts. And it proved to be showing up in the form of philosophical dialogues on YouTube between yourself and a number of other fine fellows who were giving life to this thing called Dialogos, this form of dialogue that goes beyond itself and is incredibly enlivening and meaningful and takes you on a journey to expansive domains, all from the comfort of your conversational seat. So that's sort of how I came to this, but it's been transforming me in the process, and it's been continually recursively flowing out into my own life as I've been getting my life together, which has been the real project of the last couple of years. And it's called me from my own curiosity, from my own seeking to find wisdom with sagely people and making all these great friendships as well through the course of participating in these dialogues. I was drawn to a work or something deeper, and this has become my vocation, my calling. It feels like it's my work to do in this life, at least in the future as I can see it. Like I really want this work. I'm going to say what that is, but I really want it. Like I feel like I need it, and it is the thing that is nourishing and life-giving to me, and it's also life-giving to whomever I participate with as well, which is beautiful. So I have been gradually becoming the person who can do that job at all or do it well. And a lot of that has been at the level of communicating it, participating with lots of very different kinds of people, with very different understandings of what this modality of transformative dialogue is. And for me to then show up and be revealed and drawn out in different ways by each person that I've spoken with. And that has gradually taken the form of a dialogic practice, which is, I've had the fortune of being thrown into trying to start my first business, trying to really engage in the world for the first time in a full way outside of academics and whatever, to really be in the world, to really be sticking your hands in the soil and, planting things. And so I'm doing that in the context of something that has not been done before in my field of awareness, that has not been a possibility. It's been really creating my own path, drawing on the work of you guys and drawing on every single conversation that I have. Every experience of it sort of develops what it is or what it could be. And so, the practice of transformative dialogue is how I've come to communicate what this is, more than focusing on Dialogos itself. I've been seeing transformative dialogue as a practice that could be made available to a whole wide range of people and of great benefit to a wide range of people for the deeply real realities of personal relationship, romantic relationship, processes of development, the capacity to listen, the capacity to move out of states of stuckness into states of flow, which is both the most rewarding thing you can do, and for me, a process of healing and integration as well. Because the characteristic of fragmentation and trauma is so often one of stuckness, and bringing things into flow and being able to bring forth myself anew at the tip of the horizon of each sentence, to speak something new of myself. That's just been an incredibly rewarding thing. Though I don't want to lay too much out. I'm also doing a men's initiative right now, and that's a big part of this whole map and territory that I'm on. But I want to throw it back to you at this moment.
I'm going to pry just a little bit more, if that's okay, because there's been such a proliferation of these dialogues, these online dialogues in the last few years. You and I have both had our share of participation in those. And they vary. They are various in the sense that their aims and their ends and their means and their formats vary quite a bit, right? It's very, Dialogos, in the way that John and I talk about it, has become a very equivocal term in its use, which is fine. That's to be expected. It's really become, I think, as a bit of philosophical nomenclature. It's basically become it now stands to mean any form of meaningful dialogue. It's not exactly the sense in which we use it. We think we try to use it in more of a particular way to mean a particular form, a particular process that emerges as a consequence of a dialectic within a dialogue, and one that has particular features and a particular phenomenology. But it's understandable that that term, I think, now is used very it's not disambiguated in that way typically when it's used. And like I said, I think that's to be expected. And I think that one of the reasons for that is because these dialogues are so various in their forms and in their formats. This is very much an experimental process. People are sort of trying out different formats, trying out different modes of engagement to see which one tends to bear the most fruit and which is more replicable and so on. So ultimately, there needs to be a process of selecting certain features that seem to work better than others, whether it be the number of people participating in a dialogue, whether it be how constrained they are by a topic or not, how improvisational they are, how premeditated they are, right? All of these things factor into as ingredients into what ultimately comes into being in the course of the actual process once it takes flight. So for you, ultimately, whether it's been explicit or not, there must be some kind of selection of features that you're doing right now. You must be fishing out or teasing out certain conditions that you prefer, that for you seem to work better pragmatically than others in terms of fostering the right kind of relation and the right kind of dialogue to give rise to the experience that's intended. So I'm curious, insofar as you've kind of thought through some of these details. I mean, I know you have because you're a thoughtful guy. What kinds of features, as specifically or as generally as you like, do you find yourself selecting in order to try and recreate a more house style of dialogue for your own practice?
Sure. Great question. And I first of all, I think that concern that was raised a lot by John Vervaeke and yourself here of Dialogos sort of becoming debased as a word is something that I felt a lot of care towards how to approach that. And it took some time before I began to think, well, perhaps we can consider Dialogos a practice. And somebody had said that on the circling course you guys did. And I thought, this is helpful. It's a little bit like practicing music. We can practice it, but also it's not going to be music until music is happening. And when music is happening, it's sort of just happening, and it's beyond the separated individuality of this person's instrument and this person's instrument. And it has a directionality of its own in a certain kind of way. So the way I'm seeing it now, and the way that I've come to simplify it and make it more readily accessible, is that what I am practicing is transformative dialogue. And what could emerge in transformative dialogue is Dialogos. That is the flow. That is the place where. So let's not get ahead of ourselves, first of all, and just bring it back to the hygiene and the skill and the practice of cultivating a healthy quality dialogue space. Obviously, some respect and intentionality towards with whom you are practicing this, who you're in dialogue with. That's a great place to start. For me, it is a gradual build. We start precisely where we are. So there isn't a skill level entry point, nor is there a particular point in the conversation where it starts. It's like taking a walk with someone, and we gradually begin where we are, and the thing sort of moves naturally. However, as one of my sort of key interventions and protocols, practices, is to bring meditation in. I spent several years meditating, found a lot of value in it, and eventually ended up guiding meditation. And so I do that as a process of dropping in. And this is to really prepare people for what's to come next, which is the opening of a space, or a we space, that exists between the participants. Just sort of slowing down as I describe it to sort of feel into it as I'm talking about it, rather than just talk about it in the abstract. There's a dropping into the body that I bring with that meditation, which is very important. It's not just a cognitive, rational dialogue. We want to be feeling our feet, feeling our guts, feeling our hearts. Then I bring in the listening with the ears, listening with the body as a whole listening instrument, all of the senses sort of coming together, and then a listening to the space. And that's sort of the foundation laying process. And then we sort of arrive here, and there's a bit of calmness, there's some intention, and we're at ease with not knowing precisely where it's going to go. Because that is actually where a lot of the value rests in this transformative dialogue practice, is we want to get somewhere that we haven't been before. We don't want to be taken there, but we want to go on a journey with somebody every step of the way to go somewhere where both of us didn't really know where it was going to go. But at the end, we're like, hey, wow, that was fucking incredible. Like, how did we get here? And that here that we get to is not just like somewhere we arrived in the conversation. It's that the quality of the conversation as we moved through it gradually sort of changed us, and we got more into it, more into the flow. And the space between us grows in integrity, and this requires some time. So my sense of it is that 90 minutes is actually the perfect window for a session, and that's what I do in my practice. And so this is as far as I want to lay out at this point on the general practices, but I think part of what you allude to is that it's deeply related to the practitioner of it. And a dialogue with you and a dialogue with me and a dialogue with somebody else is going to be very, very unique. And so my practice of transformative dialogue is quite inseparable from my unique process of life journeying, the qualities of my sort of integrated autism and how I listen and how I perceive. I have a sort of capacity to become quite like an empty, spacious observer without any judgment. And so I put no force or preference on the movement of the other person. And so it really allows them to sort of come forth and reveal themselves, but also be revealed by the quality of the way that they're being listened to, which they might not necessarily have experienced elsewhere in that way.
Right. So it sounds like there are a few things that you're trying to adopt that are generally features of successful dialogue, but that require a tinkering and a tuning of certain conditions. So one being the combination. I think this is a powerful combination when it works, is the combination of being willful and intentional, and also being subject to the spontaneous and the unexpected at the same time. That you're not simply being dragged somewhere, nor are you trying to force yourself somewhere where it seems you seem unable to go, but that you're striving, your will is striving until it can seize an opportunity to relinquish itself and surrender itself to something ineluctable, something that will till you catch the wind, in other words, right? I mean, sailing metaphors or surfing metaphors are, I think, used so often because they seem to imply that combination, the combination of technique and a certain amount of self-determination, but also ultimately a sense of awe and deference for those winds and forces that once they take hold can't but be obeyed because of their implicit potency, right? And their implicit power. And so you take yourself up to a point where you can surrender it over to those forces once they emerge and appear. And then you have a successful combination of will being used to negate itself in some sense. And that's part of what I'm hearing from what you're saying. And I think it's consistent with the way we often talk about these things as combined of those two elements, which I think is very interesting. The idea of starting from where you are, that reminds me a lot of circling, actually, which also begins very much from where you are and using where you are at present, what's implicit in the present moment, using that as a mechanism for generating the momentum rather than using some kind of exterior object to generate the momentum, such as a topic, like a virtue in the Socratic dialogue. I don't particularly think there's only one way to summit this practice. I don't think there's only one way to the top, as it were. But one thing I think about a lot, and John and I have talked a lot about, and Guy and so on, is to what degree dialogue, or indeed dialogos, if we're talking about it more technically, can be finessed with very idiosyncratic conditions and ingredients, such as two people who start off at a particular place at a particular time without any given structure or organization to the dialogue. They simply charge forward. I've had my share of dialogues like that, and I know you have too, as opposed to those that are a little bit more formalized around a sequence of activities that unfold in a particular order and that propound and build on one another. And in order to make a process replicable and generalizable, there has to, I think, be a certain amount of procedural consistency, but only if the formal requirements seem to only if there seems to be a need for it within, either because you want to be able to offer it to a wider variety of people who might not have the comfort or the enthusiasm or the sort of the predilection to be able to simply jump into something like that without some scaffolding. Like, you do need that. But there are in some situations you really don't in some situations, because the conditions of the relationship already afford and license those leaps that come in the form of dialogue that otherwise maybe need to be primed or prepared by something more formal. So the variation, right? They're all variations on a theme, and the variability is a very interesting feature of it, I think. And I also think that it's something, to some degree, that only trial and error can determine. And that's why I want to ask you this, because this is a question that doesn't come up a whole lot as we extol the virtues of dialogue. In order to be properly Socratic, this is something that John and I have been talking about a lot recently, is I want to be very attentive to the challenges of it and the dangers of it to some degree, right? You don't have a practice that is that potentiates transformation that does not come with implicit dangers. Like, I don't believe in such a thing, right? So, and if not dangers, then at least, off ramps and pits and bumps along the way and whatnot. So I'm curious to hear that from your experience in trying to apply a technique, even with a certain amount of flexibility. What have you encountered that has given you pause, or that has forced you to maybe rethink a technique, or rethink a certain approach, or rethink a certain way of relating to it, that has sort of forced you to reiterate to some degree,
Yeah. Good question too. Yeah, and I also appreciate you sort of distinguishing the more completely not knowing, freewheeling jam session style of dialogue and the more formal or intentional or topic oriented style. And just to thread through that, I do believe that actually the not knowing style that I'm sort of practicing primarily is a kind of training ground that is very affording of then coming into the more intentional, topic oriented style of dialogue. And I spoke with somebody at the Emerge gathering who was involved with emergent dialogue in Germany, and he's been at it for many years. And he said sort of the broader arc for him was that he began much more with the not knowing and just developing, observing the we space kind of developmental place to much more topic and oriented dialogues. So just to lay that out on the table. One of the troubles will be to bring a group of people who are not yet acquainted enough or necessarily well conduced to drop into this sort of not knowing precisely what it is. And the reason for that is that not knowing is uncomfortable in a certain way. It's sort of at the edge necessarily of what is known. And that brings us to the edges of ourselves, emotionally, psychologically, and otherwise. So to open this space without sufficient prowess of the people participating, of sufficient cultivation of the ground of the conversation, is to invite chaos and potentially rejection of the container, rejection of it. And I've had group sessions where I went in with this approach and people were like, I thought Dialogos was about a topic. And for me, of course, it's not really as such. In the context of my broader dialogues, my one-to-one dialogue, which is sort of, for me, the primary medium. I've heard a lot about the great value of trilogues, and I hope to get into that in the future. But right now, dialogue between two has been my primary ground. And in that context, and in the context of my own life, for that matter, I think I've seen a shift from really emphasizing and leaning into the potentiality of not knowing, because that can be a kind of opening when the knowns are the things that are constricting. To be able to move into a place of not knowing, to a place of surrender in a certain way, can be a great liberation. In the context of dialogue, it can open up a lot, and you can really go with the flow in a whole host of different directions. But these waters that we work in dialogically, philosophically, shamanistically, it's a deep interpersonal space, and with allowing depth to disclose itself, to feel into depth, to listen to depth, to speak from a place of not knowing, is in a certain way to bring the unconscious into the conscious space. And so all of these things can put us into a sort of place where shadow and edginess and things that are present and not presenced, feelings that are present and not presenced, little very minute, subtle triggers and things, all of this can occur. And so in that instance, I think there's much more of a sort of knowing, a sort of trustworthy knowing, more of a masculine pillar that is there and in a certain way within grasp, within reach of the other person, such that there's a sense that you can really engage with me if we're moving through a difficult terrain. I'm not just sort of back here, like a sort of distant therapist or something. I'm here and I'm with you. How is that landing for you?
What do you mean by this sort of this masculine pillar? This, I think I'm getting a sense of what you mean. That there's something, because there's something like we were talking before we started recording. We were talking about the fact that you really like to combine walking, sort of ambulatory activity, with dialogue, and that's it's a perfect pairing. It's a pairing we do all the time. We do that all the time without knowing that's what we're doing, right? We take a walk with someone because there's something about the joint exercise that creates, well, first of all, when we're physically walking in the same direction, we're shoulder to shoulder, we're side by side, right? That's evocative of some kind of shared goal or pursuit. And I'm sure that there are all kinds of primordial ways of understanding that in terms of earlier states and the various imperatives they made of us. So there's something kind of about when you're on sort of a shared quest or a shared adventure, there is an implicit trust that you have to have, because there's also an implicit danger, right? Even if it's the most, even if you're in the nicest, most bucolic place, there's still a sense in which if you're venturing out together, you're venturing into open-ended possibility to some degree. And so there has to be an agreement, an unspoken agreement of trust and mutual fortification. And I'm getting, when you talked about sort of you being able to stake in one another and to establish a certain kind of affective bond of trust that is not explicitly negotiated, but already a feature of the relationship and the mode of engagement. That's what I think about. I think of this idea that, well, if we're going to take a journey together or a trip, it becomes true that this is somehow a joint venture, and that because we're setting off on the same path and we're side by side, that we need to somehow be protective of one another, which is not to say to inoculate against the possibility of danger, or to protect each other from discomfort. That's not what I mean. But that this is a team exercise in some sense, right? This is the band of brothers idea. This is the fellowship idea, right? We're striking off in the same direction. And there is a certain soldierly countenance to that, right? There just is. So that's the impression I'm retrieving when you say this column or this pillar of masculine solicitude or something like that. That's the image I'm getting. Is that in the right direction?
You're really touching on something there with Band of Brothers. That really brings it up. I suppose, this is really connecting with my understanding of the men's group space. And so I'll bring that in here because it's very much concerned with this. And the image of the Knights of the Round Table has been sort of popping up in different places in my life recently. I think that these sort of group archetypes, particularly male group archetypes of fellowship, Lord of the Rings, are coming to the fore, because there's something needed that is more than just the personal, spiritual cultivation journey of confronting life. And actually my capacity to confront life more, to be more engaged in life is actually somehow measured by my degree of engagement with my good fellows, with my relationships, particularly for me, with my male relationships, and in the context of my relationship with my partner. So I see that leadership for me has to start from the middle of my life. And so it begins in the dialogues between me and my fiance, Hannah. And it's beginning in the context of these men's groups and in my dialogue practice. And I feel those are very supportive of it, because there's something very, very real, very palpable, very physiological and more than physiological that occurs when you shift into a place of more leadership and stepping in the context of your own life. And that's what I've been having the last 2 months, hallelujah, or more than 2 months, but it's really been coming to fruition in a way. And I think part of it is to be able to hold firm. And if you as a man are incapable of holding firm in the dialogue for your female partner, you actually prevent them from being able to fully bring forth their own emotions, because there might be some neuroticism or there might be whatever wants to come through. If you can't be the one that's really there, no matter what, just really present to it, you're actually not giving the assurance that is somehow a key foundation of relationship. And in the context of men in our culture, I think we've moved from a certain model in previous generations of male relationship, which came together over drinking or war or football, and usually didn't involve facing one another so much like this. We would probably stand together and look at an object or something aside from us. And so what's happening in men's work is quite unique, because you're bringing a group of guys together who are intentionally all oriented towards one another. And with that, there is cultivation of a space where there's a possibility of deeper listening than is normal, the possibility of speaking truth in this way that we can in an emergent dialogue. And with that, and this speaks to the lessons learned, is that when you go into a space of deep sensitivity together, you also need somebody who is going to be very present, sort of there as a pillar throughout, so that whatever wants to come forth can come forth, be seen and be known. And this is the confrontation that I sort of had a massive reimagining of as confrontation, as with the front of things. And when I began to conceive of it as just being with the front of things, suddenly I'd shifted from a very unhealthy view of confrontation to one that was super liberating. So those are sort of some of the qualities I think are involved, and have been lifting me up, and getting aligned with the vision of this work for me has also been something that's sort of been conforming me and getting me up and awake and ready to act, because it really feels like something that I want to bring in, I want to move towards, and that's given more of a directionality to my life, even though it's not about having a fixed plan of how we're going to solve all of the world's problems.
Mm-hmm. So there are all kinds of very classical masculine attributes that you're sort of describing here when you're talking about this confrontation. There's this idea of holding firm, this idea of you didn't say this word, but this word kept floating across my mind, which is assertiveness and aggression and finding. And I don't mean these things in an overtly violent sense, but I mean that the attitude, the fundamental attitude that disposes the instinct to hold fast, to button down, to plant one's feet, to stride, all of these things that are typically associated with male interaction, let's say, as opposed to female interaction or male-female interaction. It seems to me that in order to cohere properly, a form of dialogue that was tailored to male interaction would have to find a way of incorporating and integrating those classical male attributes, and in some sense, hosting them properly by putting just enough constraint on them to give them, to make them not just civil, but to tame them in some sense, right? And yet to allow for them to be expressed properly so that they're not subject to a form of procedural suppression or repression, as the case may be. And so when you talk about confrontation, the difference between good confrontation or healthy confrontation, I think you said, and unhealthy confrontation in a male context, what does that mean exactly to you? What do you mean by a healthy sense of confrontation between two males, as opposed to one that's oriented properly?
I think that there's vulnerability in confrontation, because you're being with the front of what is occurring in the relationship in that moment, and then being willing to sort of speak from a place of vulnerability in that, but with the intention of speaking what feels true in the moment, which might be going directly toward the other person. And I think it's like this interesting mixture of like it very much comes down to being in touch in a certain way. I think if we bring this space of sensitivity and we're not in touch in this way, if we're not like there to wrestle, then it goes a bit wrong, and it becomes less safe because people are sitting out of it, or one person is being very there and one person is being very back. And I want to make it a little clearer. It's very important to create the circle in which the thing occurs, not to jump into some depth of relationship which is disproportional right away, but to create a circle or a we with a certain intentional integrity to it, even an awareness of it, that there is us and there is also the we. And to the extent that we can build a we with a certain solidity, then what is present within that circle can come forth and interact, hopefully in a way that is oriented towards deeper integrity and love. But there has to be that container around it. If there's a sense that the rivalry between two in a group could lead to one being kicked out and shoot out of the circle, then it becomes a sort of winner takes all dynamic. We're all sort of in the circle, facing towards the center, facing towards the fire in the middle.
It sounds like what you're talking about, and I don't mean this in a reductive way, but I mean this just as something synonymous. It sounds like what you're talking about is a kind of, when people talk about the idea of team spirit, it's kind of become a bit of a flimsy term, because it's basically used to mean, enthusiasm or or some kind of propulsive energy. They have a lot of team spirit. They have a lot of oomph, heading into this game. And that's not quite what I mean, right? When we talk about team spirit, we mean a prevailing kind of patronage, some sense of shared identity that presides over all of the individual relationships, right? The way that belonging to a sect or a certain kind of organization that is religious in nature endows each participant with a sense of identity that provides the basis for person-to-person confrontation, because that the arena, the space in which you're interacting, has been preordained for your steps, right? The path has been laid for you, so that when you confront one another, you're not confronting one another in isolation. You're still somehow folded under the canopy of the spirit, the sense of overarching identity that is bestowed by your participation in that particular group. And when a collective entity is particularly well developed and particularly coherent, and I don't think that there's a way that this happens spontaneously, or it doesn't, usually under the auspices of a symbol, right? But when there is a kind of symbolic prevalence that casts a long shadow that your interactions can stay within, then those interactions all of a sudden have they're hosted by something that is superordinate to them, that can help to give them the latitude they need in order to be properly expressive, properly vulnerable, properly open, even if what is being expressed happens to be unsavory, incidentally, or violent or harsh or otherwise maybe inimical to what we consider to be sort of civil, polite interactions. But if they take place within the folds of that spirit, within the folds of that identity, they are somehow protected by it. And that spirit takes on a presence in their person-to-person relationship that helps to individualize, oddly enough. I think that's when a collective spirit, when a collective entity is doing its work, it is not trying to foster, and it doesn't implicitly foster, uniformity of character. What it does is it develops the individuality of characters by placing them into genuine and authentic relations with one another that are carried on the winds of that spirit when it emerges, which is a bit of a paradoxical thing to say, right? This idea of participating in a collective form of identity should help to beget individual relationships and the emergence of individual character, properly understood. This idea of being alone with others, in other words, right? This idea of marshaling oneself in the solitude of one's individual character and the development thereof, precisely by being placed into intimate, disclosing relationships that help to put people in touch with their own sense of organization, all the while being carried by the governance of this kind of collective entity that becomes provides the place in which all of these things can then happen. And I think it's a remarkably delicate thing, and it doesn't happen simply because we want it to, right? Like a team. I mean, even look like take your garden variety sports metaphors, right? And those tell the story. We don't need those metaphors, but those tell the story, right? You have a group of people, and sometimes they cohere. Sometimes they cohere into a proper team in a way that makes them deeply harmonious with one another and also fosters the individual capacities of each one of those players on that team. It's one of the things that happens when a team rises to an occasion. Not only do they cohere as a team, but the individual players of the team realize that they have an endowment, a facility with the sport that is awakened by that overall integrality. And it happens or it doesn't. And it happens or it doesn't. Dialogue, the kind that we've been describing, operates very much in the same way, very much in the same way. Laying the conditions for it properly, I think, becomes the challenge. Making it replicable becomes the challenge. But in what you're describing, this idea of the team spirit seems to be a helpful analog, or if not an analog, precisely a synonym for what you're describing.
Yeah. No, that's very beautifully put. And there's a massive Bayeux tapestry of threads that came and went during the course of that. And I'm just going to sort of let some of them flow through, hopefully. So one of the really valuable things that I heard come in there is the sense of a relationship to an externality or goal or a shared concern. This, I think, is very, very important for the vitality of these groups, of these group enterprises. Previous men's groups I've been in have been much more about creating a shared we, practicing a sort of emergent dialogue process and seeing what would happen and getting the fruit of that. But at this time right now, fall 2021, there is a feeling of the externality, the chaos of change that is occurring, the meta crisis, is pretty present for everybody. And it's calling us forth in a certain way as well on a deeper level. And so I spoke earlier to sort of the new sensitive man and the previous sort of traumatized industrial wartime hardworking man. But I want to draw in another notion of man, and this one's very alive for me, is more of the early tribal man, or the man in nature, the man in the campfire, because in those contexts you did have processes of initiation and relationship between men, which occurred at a multiplicity of ages and would foster the development and keep things in check. But I think they also somehow constituted an integral part of the healthy human body. And by body, I mean the sort of larger body of humanity, of the health of the culture, that there is something that occurs when male relationship is in right balance, when it's in right check across generations, that creates a physiological, psychodynamic reality of greater stability. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we know how, where we're going to go, just as sort of nomadic peoples might not know the terrain that they're moving through. And so too in these dialogues, and what's unique about them is that you're getting that team, male group bonded together dynamic, but you're also getting this very feminine component of journeying into the unknown of dialogue together with greater and greater attunement, and listening, really listening. And so with that, I see that this combination of transformative dialogue and this, what I'm proposing is a kind of deeply embedded wisdom that can emerge through the embodied relationship of men, through being known by other men is almost how we know ourselves. That's why we look for role models so much. I was looking for role models for my entire life, still do it in a certain way. I've maybe made a healthy version of it. But we know ourselves by being recognized and disclosed and respected and encountered by others, and particularly as men by other men. And that's partly why this podcast has been such an incredible gift, is because I've been able to connect with all these wise older men and women and be known by them. And even though there's an asymmetry, by being known and being on that sort of peer-to-peer playing field of dialogue, then that's just been incredibly nourishing to me. And so that's what's going on in Men Emerging. And I felt in what you said earlier, there was almost an allusion to a church or a more of a religiously organized community, or something that has more of a longevity over time. And I'm sure there are renditions of that are going to emerge in this time as well. I see this as somehow making a foray into that space without going too far into it necessarily. There's a real seasonal element to this, where the groups come together for a period of time and then they dissolve.
Right.
And with that, the likelihood of dependency or of some sort of fixed ideological narrative that then becomes self-sustaining, that becomes much less likely. So Men Emerging is not about, making everybody who's participating like me. It's about participating well with one another in a way that's mutually affording of us becoming more of ourselves, bringing in the catalytic element of the external context and how that can actually activate in this time.
That's very well said, Jacob. Yeah, that's very well said. And I think it's right. I think it's very intuitive, this idea that the group, after being after being gathered for a certain period of time, it's right that a group such as that should dissolve, because it's this idea that it has an instrumental function to help manage a first contact between individuals and within individuals. I think it's a very, very, very important feature of that practice, that it's ultimately in the service. It's a characterological project. It's not simply it's not simply or even first a communal project in the longer term, but that it's a characterological project. And that's the thing about dialogue in general and Dialogos that's important to me, that it not become a sanctuary for the sake of being a sanctuary. It's not meant to shield us from the vicissitudes of the existential responsibility of being a person. When it's working properly, it's actually precipitating a confrontation with those imperatives and helping to equip a vocabulary to enhance and deepen the contemplative presence of that confrontation, such that it can become more conscious rather than less conscious, right? I said the Dialogos, or dialogue writ large in the way that we're talking about it, should manage and help to conduce a coming into consciousness, rather than being a place where people go to take refuge from the pains of not being sufficiently known, and I think that's probably the thing that I think needs to be really closely guarded. Not guarded, that's not the right word, but it needs to. I think we need to be very vigilant about that, of not letting it become something like that, not letting it become a sanctuary that relieves us from the pain of existential solitude, but emboldens us to be more confrontational with that solitude by managing its presence in the presence of those who might know that process within us. And by having that process in us, the more known in company, we can know it better ourselves, right? And I'm hearing all of that in what you're saying, and I'm glad of it. I'm glad of it, that seems to be its target. That seems to be its telos, rather than community for community's sake, which I understand, but I'm wary of for all of those reasons, for the fact that it can be seized by and possessed with those same pernicious influences and impulses that can also afflict the individual and steer them and veer them into all kinds of directions that they might not otherwise choose for themselves if they could simply be made more conscious of them.
Yeah. And I think there's actually been a kind of, there's almost been a weird incentive created that everyone should create a community. Right. In the last few years with podcasting and everything, it's like, oh, you want to, have a livelihood, you should create a community, create a Patreon, all of that stuff. And I feel like it's not for me to actually create a community. That's not what I'm supposed to do. Mm-hmm. I feel there's a massive effect that can be had just through dialogue, through one-to-one dialogue. And it's had a massive effect upon me, and it's been gradually conforming me to it. And that's led to me being more engaged with my actual concern of my own livelihood, which turns out to be a very helpful gravitational anchor that can pull things into a sort of grounded necessity.
Yeah.
And that's part of what's driven me to become more and more clear and accessible in how this is communicated, and also to actually go to the people. Mm-hmm. And so the combination of the passion for it and the knowledge that this is my work, it would be a great travesty for me to be pulled away into something else for the necessity of money. That's driving me straight towards my own resistances and my own growth edge. And I think when we're actually aligned with the golden thread of curiosity, it necessarily is leading us towards our becoming. Mm-hmm. And so we draw in the challenge in a certain kind of way, whatever that is. There's a kind of gravitational drawing in, and you realize, oh, I'm actually in a dialogue with life itself. And all of these different instances can be seen as larger patterns. And, the relationship to cannabis and psychedelics has certainly shifted my propensity to perceive those kinds of patterns in my own life. So, yeah, and I think there's a great deal of open field about where we can sort of go from here, actually.
You mean you and I right now, or in general with the practice?
Yeah. I think where we go in the dialogue might exhibit the spirit that would enable us to have that view of our collective circumstance.
Yeah. Well, I think this idea, I think it reminds me of something that Peterson calls the divinity of interest, which is to be properly, when you're properly attentive to the processes that are at work within you, especially when they're amplified and reflected properly by your relationships, when those relationships are disposed in a disclosing way, that you're magnetized to what most demands your attention. And it shouldn't be surprising that when, let's say in your case, a group of men come together to create a relationship like that, that it is evocative of a feminine aspect of soul that emerges in the collective as a form, as so what we might call Sophia, but that has a counterpart, a source of vitality, eros in the original Platonic sense or in the Jungian sense, that helps to activate the relationship and the cognizance of what is most implicitly real and intrinsically necessary in a person's relationship with the world, to activate those forces to become conscious of them. And that's one way in which the collective process between people confers itself into the individual reckoning with that same source of eros, that same source of vitality that helps to put us in touch with what actually does and should not in the sense of an external moral imperative, but as a matter of intrinsic necessity, vector us in the direction of what is ultimate for us, in order to the target outside the scope of our current sense of self that bids us in the direction of that fuller sense of self, and when these collective practices are working properly, I think that's ultimately what they're doing. And I think that there is a feminine countenance to that, even and especially among a group of men. And that's one of the things that's, to me, it's fascinating about that process. And I don't think that's necessarily a consequence of the times, but I think it's something that sometimes we're able to confront a little bit more openly than others.
Yeah, and I think that your dialogues with John Vervaeke, Jordan Hall, and Guy Sengstock really epitomize this sort of trans-individuation, as the emerged dialogue people call it, or just that the deepening of the we space is affording of each individual in all of their individual suchness to actually come forward.
Right.
And I think all of those guys in those dialogues have a really developed feminine attunement that is uncanny.
Right. And that's no accident. It's no accident that it's a feminine attunement, right? Right. Because it's the idea of the anima, it's the soul and the feminine aspect that emerges when certain dimensions of being and experience are properly provoked or evoked, as the case may be. And yeah, I know you're right. It is quite uncanny, isn't it? It's quite uncanny. And that's why one of the things I'm right now much more interested in looking at is the relationship between dialogos, and the unconscious, the intersection between social dialogue and, let's say, more psychoanalytic dialogue, and how those axes intersect and interact, how they can be conducive to one another, how those projects relate to one another, right? Because I think that's the emergence of that feminine aspect, whether we're talking about it on an individual level as something like a Jungian anima, or on a collective level, something like a Sophia, that there's a correspondence between those things. And that's because that these dialogues are provocative of these unconscious processes and these unconscious complexes. And exactly what role that's why there is a form of possession sometimes that happens in the throes of a dialogue when it becomes rapturous, when it becomes intensive, that happens. And that needs to be, I think, looked at very closely, because it can become a source of incredible vitality and ecstasy, can become an ecstatic experience. And you can find yourself doing and saying things that seem uncharacteristic or that are not premeditated, precisely because there was a response that's being called out by the process that could not have been called out maybe in another circumstance. But what that means is that it kicks up a lot of dust, this process. It kicks up a lot of dust.
Mm.
And it's not just an experience to be born on the winds of ecstasis and to have had a brief glimpse of the good. It's not, that's not all it is, right? There's some of that maybe, but it's also, it's a confrontation with those influences, those complexes and forces that are otherwise inhibitive or prohibitive of all kinds of things, that will speak on your behalf, that will intervene in front of you, that will undermine your will and subvert it, even as you're trying to mobilize and marshal it. And an understanding of dialogos, for instance, or dialogue more generally, that cannot accommodate and understand the unconscious, its own unconscious provocations and some of their consequences, is one that will ultimately be incomplete and will risk being existentially irresponsible, or not sufficiently Socratic, if it doesn't manage to understand and appreciate the full scope of what's actually happening. This is not just a bunch of people getting together to trade propositions. There's not just logos here. There is also eros, right? Both of these principles are at work. And understanding their relationship is key. And we haven't fully, we've been thinking a lot about this, and we've been talking a lot about this. So it's definitely in mind. But there's a lot that has yet to be fully understood about this, And I mean, what's old is new again. There's nothing new under the sun. So nothing I'm saying I don't think is particularly new or innovative. We can look in the past and we can see it. And this question has been, people have pored over this question before, obviously, but I think it's a question that that I would like to start asking more pointedly. Now that the whole idea of dialogue and dialogue, now that it's, it seems to have taken flight, it's very voguish now. A lot of people are adopting it. I think that's great, but and the but is that things that are powerful conductors are just that. They're powerful conductors, and powerful conductors require a proper reckoning with their consequences, with their risks, and with all that they're conducting. The charge, when the charge is strong, it can be directed to all kinds of things, some of them unintentional, right? So I mean, the process wouldn't be as promising as it is. It wouldn't be as full of vitality as it is if it didn't also have these coterminous dangers, So it's those are the things that are occupying my thoughts right now. Is what is that relationship between the conscious Socratic process, and it's important for it to be a conscious Socratic process, and all of those unconscious things that are activated and amplified by that process that come into dialogue with the conscious attention that is being shaped and hopefully sharpened by the dialogue itself. That's one of the ways I think dialogue can become a means of developing rapport with the unconscious, is precisely because it's trying to sharpen and tune the instrument of consciousness by dissociating it and dispossessing it of those false beliefs or false ways of being that otherwise inhibit its acumen, right? So yeah, much more to be thought about here.
I think what you're doing is awesome. I think this is a very commendable, very exciting inquiry to be oriented towards. And whether or not those waters have been journeyed into before is, I think it's very important now at this time, fording this particular transition of the human species, that this kind of inquiry is made. And I think I can really concretize this, because I've paid a great deal of attention to that process, and Dialogos has not just been a foray into ecstasis or catharsis. For me, it's been a whole range of things, and one of them is this revealing of or relating to my own unconscious. And so one of the ways in which this practice really is a footing of that is that the quality of listening, which I have garnered particularly from Guy Sengstock over the last couple of years, is when you can really practice that with others in dialogue and then necessarily have it come out into your own life, it can be the thing that breaks you out of the jail cell, breaks you out of the psychic fog, the matrix, the trauma, the response, whatever it is, the pattern that clouds your entire experience. It's the thing that gives you that just a little bit of space to notice and inquire. And from that place, the thing can begin to be spoken. And in the context of relationship with a partner, it's like incredible to have the tools of Dialogos coming into personal relationships. There's a huge frontier for it. But it's allowed me directly. There was a conversation I had with Guy, episode 12, where he really spoke into my experience from his own experience in a way that sort of, just as our last conversation did, it sort of was a prelude to the process that I was already in. And so great practitioners of dialogue can be these kind of, they can act as wayposts along the way through an unknown terrain that somehow reflect you back to yourself and get you aligned with yourself in a way that you can sort of see the thing that you can't see. And now, previously it was me with my own things coming up. Now supporting my partner, if she's got things coming up, I become the Socrates. I become the one who is being present and inquiring towards, so that the thing that is becoming present, that you don't quite know what it is in the other person, to actually be able to tease that out and give the room, but also have the continuity of presence with it, that it can begin to come forward. And so that is the unconscious thing, which God knows how long it's been unconscious, but it can begin to come forth. And so those are sort of very concrete instances. But I think what you spoke to is that with the flow, with the deepening of flow, which Dialogos is associated with the flow state, the more flow that I've experienced, the more I've accelerated in a certain way the process of my own growth, by which I mean I have more continuously drawn towards me the challenges. So the more that I'm flowing, it sort of stirs up that meeting of my blind spot and the opportunity to make the mistake or whatever that reveals it to me. And I think that's very analogous to psychedelics as well. I think the more you're delving into that, the more you're going to be drawing forth those things. You're gonna stir it up. But it's also a great aid in navigating through that as well. So it's very interesting. And there was one more thing that I wanted to bring through from the context of men, which is this passion or fire that can be drawn out, that somehow is like there under the surface between young men, between men potentially of all ages. That one, when it's present in one, it draws forth in another, and it's provocative in that way. And that can also bring out what's the blockage, what's the shadow that's disconnecting you from your fieriness. Mm-hmm. Is fire associated with anger or something like that? Yeah. So this fire, it seems to me, is an essential property of what's needed to navigate this time. And the way that I know that is because it's essential to my own life to get this practice going so that it can be flowing and that I can be really inviting in the people that I can work with, and then, make money and lift myself up. And then ultimately the vision is to be activating other people. And I've already got proof of concept on this by someone who I've been practicing with, a good friend of mine. And he said it started out with our dialogues, and now it's flown out into all of these new relationships and dialogues.
Really?
With this sort of Dialogos style understanding. Now, if you give someone a window into a way of having this kind of meaningful dialogue, then the fruit and the affect of that can be multiplied by 10. Mm-hmm. And those people could then go out and multiply it by 10. And so it's a very powerful, nonlinear approach to change in society. And the reason that I believe in it is because I have been the beneficiary of other people like yourself, like Jordan Hall and others, who gave me the time of day at a certain point and gave me the attention without any sense of what they would get back from it. But in doing that, demonstrating their own virtuous understanding that attends to reality wherever it shows up. And then that will sort of, the greatest change you can achieve is one where you don't actually understand how it works or what the full implications will be.
Right.
You just got to be surrendered to the process of doing it.
Right. Because it steals over you. It's comprehensive in that you notice the world itself changing before you notice that the change is emanating out from something within your character that is reorienting. There's the metanoetic process of turning your sense of attention is brings about changes to the texture of the world that don't immediately seem related to the changes that are actually happening, the change of humors that's happening inside of you, but that those things are synchronized. And that I've noticed this too, that changes of attitude, and I mean attitude in the deepest sense of the term, right? The fundamental disposition toward being. Changes of attitude are very surreptitious, because I think that every you don't notice the change happening in the interior. You simply notice that the world is change. It's accented differently, right? Certain problems are accented differently. Relationships are accented differently. Prospects and problems are accented differently. And the tone and the position you're able to take relative to certain things begins to change. And then you notice, wait a second, there's something comprehensive happening in the way that I relate to myself and relate to the world. And all of these things are secondary characteristics of that fundamental change. When the world looks different, it's because fundamentally there's a change that's happening to to shift the way that it presents to me and the way that I present to it. And that is something that that makes it, requires a lot of patience, I think, for that reason. You know, it's an exercise. A lot of these things are exercises in delayed gratification. We don't yet know what kind of effects they're going to have, how quickly their effects are going to come. This is not an exercise of instant enlightenment or something like that. This is a gradual process of redistributing attention in the deepest possible sense, redistributing and tuning and tutoring the attention of consciousness so that it begins to attend to the right things, right? And that's the Socratic project in a nutshell, right? It's the training of attention to attend to the right things. And when it begins to do that, obviously the signification of the world seems to change with it, right? Because all of a sudden, the criterion that that our attention places on the world changes what is elicited back from it, right? And it's an incredible thing to start to witness that, you know, because it seems like something that has happened almost by chance, right? It seems like something that's happened outside of you. Of course, it's not, right? It is and it's not, I should say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I resonate with the patience as well. I think in this moment, I both want to extol that there is something here, that there is a transformative process here that is actually a quality of reality that we can tune into and experience. Just as surely as if you take some psychedelic mushrooms, you are going to go on a journey into a different ontological plane of experience. If you participate in a dialogue with me or with you, serendipitously, there's a good chance that you're going to experience something different to an ordinary conversation. And with that said, the integration of transformation is a never-ending journey that I'm on, and I expect to be on forever, really. But but it takes time, and the affect of a great conversation, as we were speaking to before we started, you can have a conversation and it can be 2 or 3 months or 6 months or a year before you fully realized the insight or the fruit that was being alluded to and revealed.
That's right. That's right. Especially when the insight or the fruit doesn't appear in the form of a concrete proposal or a concrete belief or a particular insight, that it has much more to do with how you find yourself behaving, right? How honest you find yourself being in certain situations, or how you're choosing to relate to the act of conversation itself, right? It might be something completely behavioral rather than something propositional. And I think, if the behavioral can become conscious, then it can become become subject to insights that can create a pedagogy from the process. But even if it's just behavioral, that's a very, very significant shift. And that's cumulative, I think. You don't necessarily get that after one. It can happen after one dialogue that's particularly profound or that's particularly availing. But I think in general, it's much more like it's the preponderance, it's the cumulative effect of changing the way that you relate to the process and the act that changes the way that you approach it in the first place, by resetting the ground rules that you tend to take for granted otherwise, right?
Yes, as I wrote in the essay on Dialogos that was so inspired by your dialogues, in Dialogos, the cup seems to be always full when you return. There's never a sense that it's an inexhaustible reservoir that exists between people in inquiring into the ground of reality, which is ultimately a very mysterious thing. And I want to thank you for today. You've been very generous with your time and attention and questions, and your dialogic fellowship has been a great honor of mine to share in.
Oh, thank you, Jacob. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry it took as long as it did. And that was entirely my fault, but it was well worth the wait. It was good to see you. It was good to catch up with you properly. And it was good to be, it was good to kind of to push the envelope on this a little bit and to take ourselves a little bit further down the road. And that was great. I really enjoyed it. So thank you, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the Socratic rigor.
All right.